Hi, everyone. I'm just going to wait as participants filter in, and then we'll get started in just a little while. Okay, everyone, let's get started for today. I'm Mariya Karimjee. I'm a journalist and an FGM survivor. I'm based in Karachi, Pakistan, and I'll be moderating the webinar today. The focus today will be on FGM and emergencies, something that's largely under-researched. What we do know is that it's neglected because it's not considered life-saving. During humanitarian crises, focus tends to shift to things like food, power, shelter, and women's empowerment programs tend to get less attention. Certainly, FGM gets less attention. For the international community, COVID-19 has been a wake-up call. The majority of countries who have signed on to the Sustainable Development Goals specifically target 5.3, the elimination of FGM by 2030. They're now realizing that this pandemic not only presents a challenge, it potentially rolls back progress to date. Today, we'll be hearing from Berhanu Legese, technical specialist for UNFPA UNICEF Joint Program on the elimination of female genital mutilation. He'll be speaking on behalf of Dr. Nafissatou Diop, Chief of the Technical Division, United Nations Population Fund, Gender and Human Rights Branch. Then we'll hear from our keynote speaker, Dr. Nahid Toubia, a leading researcher and anti-FGM activist. After that, we'll have a panel discussion with Cynthia Umarungi from the Community of Practice on FGM and Chiara Cosentino from End FGM European Network. During this time, we'll also be hearing from Patricia Pennetier from the European Commission. We'll have a short audience Q&A. Valentina Fanelli from the Italian Association from the Women in Development will give brief remarks before Harriet Hakulu, Child Protection Specialist, Prevention of Harmful Practices, UNICEF New York, gives closing remarks. Okay, so now that you have some sense of everything we're going to try and accomplish today ambitiously in 2 hours, let's do a little bit of housekeeping. We do have translators today, and so at the bottom of your webinar screens, you will see a small image that shows how to access that translator function. Also at the bottom of the screen, there is a window for chats. That's for you to share any comments, questions, concerns, information about your activism. There's also a separate section for Q&As. And so if you have questions specifically that you want to ask people as this webinar continues, use that to direct those questions towards us. Great. So now I'm going to turn it over to Berhanu Legese, who's speaking on behalf of Dr. Diop in the United Nations Population Fund Gender and Human Rights Branch for the opening remarks. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Mariya. First of all, I apologize. I have some connection issues, so I'll not be able to switch on my camera. As Mariya indicated, I'm bringing you greetings, but also apologies from Nafisa Toubia, our Chief for Gender and Human Rights Branch at UNFPA, was not able to join this webinar as planned earlier due to other competing commitments. So I'm making this remark on our behalf. And this is very important and timely webinar for us, both at UNFPA and UNICEF. For us, both the UNFPA and UNICEF, we are happy to support and be part of today's webinar, and also the international stakeholder dialogue organized prior to this webinar on preventing and responding to female genital mutilation in emergency and humanitarian context. UNFPA UNICEF joint program on the elimination of female genital mutilation, which is the largest global program addressing FGM and been operational since 2008, has ongoing partnership with AIDOS, GAMS, and FGM European Network. And this dialogue and also the webinar initiative is part of this partnership. So we'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge this organization for their efforts in making sure and implement this dialogue webinar, and also others to take part in this initiative in different capacities. As Mariya indicated earlier, the theme of the dialogue is very pertinent to the work we all do in addressing female genital mutilation, and hence deserves due attention. Humanitarian context is affecting our work from different directions. Issues like FGM are being sidelined and are not considered an essential area of intervention during humanitarian context. The COVID-19 pandemic is adding more to this concern. The situation is negatively affecting resource allocation to the sector, as the focus tends to be on some other areas. However, one thing is clear for all of us, and we need to stand up for it. FGM is a human rights issue and closely related to women and girls' bodily autonomy. As partners in development and humanitarian response, we are all accountable to ensure the protection of human rights in all situations and settings, and this is very important. With UNFPA's strong position and commitment of addressing all the issues that we represent from a humanitarian, peace, and development nexus point of view, we join our partners here today on loud call to action for all stakeholders and donors to consider FGM as one of the life-saving critical areas of intervention during humanitarian context, and to provide the needed technical and financial support. It is critical in our joint effort to realize the vision of eliminating female genital mutilation by 2030 as reflected in Sustainable Development Goals. We are at a moment where we need to step up, join hands, and accelerate our efforts at all levels. Let me end by saying thank you all for making time to join this webinar with different capacities, and we encourage you to stay throughout the webinar and actively engage in the conversation. We strongly hope that the reflections and recommendations coming out of this webinar will be noted and taken into account to better inform our work, initiatives, and action at different levels. Again, thank you all for, and over to you, Mariya.
Thank you so much for that, Berhanu, and Dr. Diop for those remarks. We are extremely grateful to have with us today. Oh, I'm sorry, you guys, I haven't turned on my video again. Give me a second to do that. I'm back. Okay, so we are extremely grateful to have with us today Dr. Naheed Toubia. She's a renowned activist, clinician, and researcher who is a leading voice in the African movement to abolish female genital mutilation. In 1994, with a few other African immigrants in the USA, she set up Rainbow, Research Action and Information Network for Bodily Integrity of Women. The organization was instrumental in taking the issue of FGM out of the realm of medicalization. Today, she continues to advance women's and young people's rights in sexual and reproductive health in some of the most challenging countries in the world. I will now hand it over to you, Nahid. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Mariya. It's lovely to meet you. And I want to start by saying good morning, good afternoon to some of you. It may be even good evening. Welcome to this webinar. I hope we can exchange some information, even enjoy some of the information we're going to listen, even if it's such a bleak subject. I want to first thank also the joint program of the United Nations, and especially UNFPA, and in particular, Ms. Stephanie Barrick for inviting me. I have been out of the international realm or international field of FGM, and I was working only in Sudan, but today is my comeback. I'm back after 12 years of staying away from international forums. I want to start by giving you a little bit more information about myself. I come from Sudan, and for those who may or may not know where Sudan is, it's Northeast Africa, just right at that fault line between Arab North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. So we're a very diverse rainbow of brown and black people, but we're very influenced by Arabic culture. The majority of the population are Muslim, although there is quite a substantial different groups of Christians within Sudan. I'm personally not cut, and I am so grateful to my mother, who was married young, but taught herself and investigated until she realized this was a horrific practice and decided I should not be cut. And every girl after that in our family was never cut. However, my mother herself was cut. My two older sisters were cut. And I have, I don't know, lots and lots and lots of friends, colleagues, hundreds of students and younger colleagues who work with me who are cut, who have spoken to me about it. So while I personally will never claim that I have gone through this horrific experience, I have spoken to many people who have. I have worked on this issue for about 40 years now. Yes, I am much older than my lovely picture on the poster of this webinar. I worked first in my country, Sudan, when I was a young doctor, and I spoke out, and I was very, very upset about this horrific practice that was affecting women in my neighborhood, in my school, in my country. And then I moved globally and I worked internationally with Rainbow, as
sur le plan international.
Mariya said.
Comme l'a dit
and
Mariya.
I also then worked across Africa in almost every African country.
Pratiquement tous les pays d'Afrique.
I'm hearing the French translation. I'm not sure why. Can you just mute it, please?
J'entends.
Just 1 second. I think Alain, you're speaking as a panelist. Can you just make sure that you're in the channel? Sorry about that.
Okay. So in 1993, I was already in New York. Hello? I was working with the Population Council in New York. And due to several circumstances, unfortunately, as much as I'd like to tell you more stories, we can't say everything here in this limited time. I ended up compiling a book that had the latest good information about FGM in the world. And actually the book was called Female Genital Mutilation, A Call for Global Action. And it was the first time it was actually publicly called Female Genital Mutilation. Because by that time, there was a lot of consultations amongst us women activists, and we decided that's the term that's going to go forward. The book came out in English and then Arabic and French. And it was a game changer because, as Mariya said, it's when we decided we cannot just keep apologizing for this practice as a misguided cultural practice. We have to put it right at center as a violation of girls and women, and underage people have not chosen to do this. So today, as I'm back in the international arena, for those who haven't been, working on this issue for as long, I'd like to share some historical background so that we're all on the same page. Historically, the movement against FGM, other than a little bit by the colonialist power in Africa, started really in the 1960s and 70s as African countries were becoming independent. There's a lot of young doctors, mostly men, but some women, and also midwives, who started being very concerned about the complications that happen from this practice. And it was mostly the infibulation. Sudan actually was one of the countries where doctors started speaking up very early on in the 60s. We also in Sudan hosted the first international conference organized by the World Health Organization. And very interesting in that conference, the doctors wanted to ban only infibulation, the extreme type that of course affects, that physically affects the body and affects delivery of women. But it was the African women, particularly midwives from Somalia and from Sudan, who stood up and said, no way. If we're going to talk about this internationally, then we have to say all kinds of cutting is wrong. And that was a very important moment, as early as in the early, I think it was 61, 62, that conference. And the African women stood up and said, no, you cannot differentiate between types. By the 1980s, some international work has been done, unfortunately, some of it done by Western women who are not always respectful of, or in collaboration or in conversation with African women. And so there was a counter movement by some groups of African women, supported by the UN actually, to start work on this. But they decided that we can't just say this is wrong. We have to respect African culture. And therefore they started calling it harmful traditional practices. And sometimes these terms are still around to this day. But the idea was like, we have to celebrate African culture, but just sometimes say, there are some bad cultural things that we shouldn't be doing. It was okay, it was a step forward, but it wasn't enough because it didn't go to the root of why this is happening. So in 1990s, the women's movement across the world actually went to the Vienna Human Rights Conference in 1993. And there was a big event in the NGO forum of women testifying against women's violation and making women's rights are human rights, which was the first time that the slogan, women's rights are human rights, was introduced. Can you believe it? Before that, women's rights were not human rights. So I presented a testimonial against FGM in that as part of this global women's movement. And because by that time, the book that I had published was ready. And I think from that moment, slowly we managed to change the dialogue around FGM from please stop, this is just a bad practice we shouldn't be doing, to put it at the center of violation of women's bodies and human rights. Having done that, I think the movement expanded much more in the last 10 years, let's say,
encore plus au cours des 10 ou 15 dernières années.
And a lot of women's groups and youth groups took it as their cause
Beaucoup des femmes
part of the demand for bodily autonomy, bodily integrity, and choices on sexuality.
Beaucoup d'efforts qui ont été faits récemment pour lutter contre.
Yeah, exactly. Alain, we can hear the French. Thank you.
Okay, so that's the history. That's where we are now. I would like also, as somebody who's worked with this, we're still hearing you.
I don't
Okay,
understand. I'm on the French channel.
Alan,
Maybe I switched to
yeah.
English channel, then something's wrong.
Yeah, let's just pause a little bit. Pertan, can you check
Okay.
your channel and just have Alan pause for a little bit and carry on the chat, please. Continue, Ms. Knight.
Okay. As somebody who's worked on this issue internationally in many, many African countries, as well as my own country, Sudan, I want to share some of the values and experiences and learning and understanding around this issue. It may seem very simple. Okay, you know, something bad is horrible. You cut children. It's a violation. That's true. But having said that, and we all agree it's something terribly wrong, how do we actually go about stopping it depends on our values, really. And why do we do these things? So I'm going to share some of these values. Some of you might agree with me, some might disagree, but I think for transparency, I thought that would be important. The first thing is I challenge the idea that traditional societies are just untouchable or should be preserved. I think any society, no matter how traditional or modern, whatever these definitions are in constant change. As they say, the only constant is change. And that is true, whether it's in an African village or in New York City. Change is happening all the time. So the idea that we should preserve African society in these nice, cute villages is something I don't contribute to. But change must also happen from within. We could not impose it, but we can support it. And when I say we, I don't mean just North versus South or West versus East or Africa. Even myself, if I go to another country, if I go to another section, part of my own country, to another city or town or village, I have to understand and respect who they are, because I am still an outsider to them. So a certain understanding and dialogue is important. So if we want to support change, we should look into the way to do it. I think donors, international organizations, non-Africans, all even Africans across different communities. The most important thing is to say, what is change is happening anyway? And a change that I believe is positive, because change can go backwards as well as forwards. You know, change could be towards conservatism or towards liberalism. So I can look into where change is happening and I catalyze that change. I don't come and impose a new change. I look for my allies. I look for who I think will be the voice that I want to support. And that's how I would do it. Another value that I hold is that you cannot say that development support is value neutral. I know for the UN system, they would like to see themselves as neutral, and I think they have to, at least because they're multilateral. But there is no such thing as once you inject some inputs, whether it's money, whether it's methodology, whether it's voices, it has values. So it's better to be clearer about our values rather than pretend to be value neutral. So as we're going in to change society, to stop FGM or any other social change, we have to ask ourselves, do we just want to reinforce the status quo? The status quo might be a dictatorship, maybe conservative religious, maybe control of the men and the elderly over the weaker, the less voice, the weaker voices. Obviously, the control of men over women. Or are we people who want to move societies towards justice, equality, and the rule of law? I personally very openly choose to modernize society and move it towards justice, equality, and the rule of law. The idea is like, don't touch, don't change doesn't work for me, because it's not true. Because also you cannot stop FGM alone. Sometimes people talk about FGM as if it's kind of an entity grabbed on its own. It's a dynamic that's part of what's happening in society. And the dynamic in any society is usually about control over power and resources. So if you go to a society and you reinforce, you put money in through a project that reinforces the existing status quo, the existing power dynamic, you have to be aware that that's what you're doing and don't pretend you're not doing that. So in the case of FGM, for example, one of the issues that I really, and this may be controversial, one of the things I've really had issues with is when people go and put so much money and resources into the religious establishment in the hope that if they announce FGM is bad, that's going to make it disappear. Number one, it doesn't work. It's good to have some religious people saying it's not part of Islam or Christianity or Judaism, because by the way, it's happening among people who believe in all kinds of religions. But if you keep hammering and keep enforcing the voice that say yes or no about FGM within the religious leaders or even the village leaders, you're just re-emphasizing the status quo that causes FGM. So a lot of the time, programs ignore women's voices. And for a long time, they've ignored women as if they're just a byproduct of this wanting to stop FGM. Fortunately, that's not happening now. And I just want to say that in reality, young African women and youth in general are very powerful and they're rising. And they should and will own their own bodies. And it's not going to be up to the village leaders or the religious leaders or even to the heads of government. Anyway, that's my point of view, but I also want to refer you to the latest joint program, UNICEF-UNFPA annual report for 2019. And I was so pleasantly surprised when it actually is called Empowering Girls and Women to Lead Change. I think we're finally here. It's empowering women and girls that is going to lead the change on FGM, not the religious leaders, not the village leaders. We need to engage everybody. I'm not saying we don't engage these people. We engage doctors, we engage, I don't know, media people, we engage everybody. But the leadership has to be with the girls and women. So that's what my 2 cents about what I think how FGM could be tackled. Next, I'm gonna very quickly share with you the latest information of what's happening in Africa and the diaspora at this point. In 2017, there was, sorry, I think it was 2018 that it was published, an article with the British Medical Journal, and you know, British Medical Journal is a very prestigious medical journal. It was a review article that looked at the evidence through surveys, particularly the demographic and health surveys made repeatedly in, I think, 29 African countries, to look as whether the rates of FGM are still the same or going down. I am very pleased to announce that the article at least says that the percentage decline in the prevalence of FGMC among children aged 0 to 14 years old, the decline was highest in East Africa, followed by North Africa and West Africa. The actual numbers, it decreased from 71% in 1995 to 8% only in 2016 in East Africa. In North Africa, it declined from 57% to 14%. And in West Africa, it declined from 73% to 25%. Obviously, these are big categories of countries. If you look at specific countries, it may be very different. Some countries are still in the 70s. My own country, Sudan, we still think we're probably still in the at least the 60%, 60-something percent, down from 87%. But anyway, there is decline and it's dramatic. Anybody who wants any reference to this particular article, I can provide it to the organizers and they can look it up. There's a question. Do we know why this change happened? Is it happened because of programmatic effort, whether from the UN or NGOs, international, local movements, Or is it part of an intrinsic dynamic of social change that's happening in Africa? We don't have the answer for that. My own, I don't know, guess is that it's probably a bit of both, programmatic as well as what is happening in Africa as a continent and in each country, from education to economics to urbanization and women movements and other things. I'm going to discuss that a little bit more later. In the diaspora in non-African countries, there has been almost every country that has African immigrants have passed a law against it. In many countries, there hasn't been any cases that were brought to court, but in some cases there have been, and they were used as a deterrent. There has been measures about travel restrictions and all kinds of things that we don't have time to discuss now, but there has been a lot happening. And I think in terms of policy, there isn't a lot more to be done. The next thing I want to talk about is not what effort has been made, but what's actually happening in African countries, as well as Asian countries, by the way. And I want to give a big nod and thank you to our moderator, Mariya Karimjee, for an amazing, powerful and courageous podcast that she has online called The Heart. I encourage you all to go and listen to it. It's really amazing. But it also, to me, is exemplifying what's really happening. Women and youth in Africa are speaking up. In Africa and in Asia, in the small places in Asia where FGM is prominent, in her country, it's only among a particular sect. In Pakistan and to some extent, maybe India. But across Africa, women and youth are speaking up. They're demanding their rights. They're creating movements in many countries, wherever they're located, in the north or in the south. There is a generation of youth that is very different from the previous generation. They are educated, they are urbanized, they're carrying, smartphones, or they're connected to the world. Also, the new generations in the diaspora among immigrants are very different. They're speaking up, they're organizing, they're saying, we have to stop this, never again. So it's unlike the older generation who are trying to keep the traditions of the old country, the mother country. The new generation are very different. And that's normal. It happens all the time. Second, third generation immigrants become more and more like the countries they go and live in. Also, people are traveling across the world. I mean, I'm surprised amongst the young people I work with in Sudan. There are people who are coming back from the United States. Some grew up in the UK or in Europe or in France or Ireland, some in Saudi Arabia or the Emirates. The world has become a real village. Everybody's moving around and they're listening and they're learning and they want to be world citizens. I think the idea that Africa is still in the villages needs to be revised a little bit. I'm not saying there are not people who are poor or living in villages, but I know people who kids who were moved from a small village in Western Sudan and ended up in New York City and grew up in New York City and came back to Khartoum they didn't even pass through the capital when they moved from their village to New York. So we have to be aware of all these dynamics that are happening. Also, we have to realize that even politically and economically, Africa is changing. There is more stability in more countries. There is emerging democracies, and there are expanding freedoms for organizing and freedom of speech. So if we're going to keep working, we have to realize the Africa of 2021, not the Africa of the 1950s and 60s. To make it more real, to make it more compelling, I'm going to share with you quickly my experience when I went back to Sudan. I was working internationally. I was exhausted. I just had enough of the bickering and the backbiting, the backstabbing and vying for resources and voice. And so I went back to Sudan in 2008, and I just stopped working internationally. But I started talking to young people about sexual reproductive health and rights, just in general. I wanted them to be aware of it. We're living under a horrible Islamic conservative military regime. And they chose FGM as their priority. Not only that, they came up with the idea of start an initiative called Ana Lan, which means I will not. They wanted to take personal responsibility. They didn't want to just go to other people and say, hey, stop, you're bad. They said, from now on, I am going to stay, I'm going to stop, I'm going to put it online, I'm going to put it on Facebook, I'm going to take it to the radio stations, I'm going to tell everybody I'm stopping. So that was quite something. Are we running out of time, Mariya?
Yes, a little bit.
I'm going to finish very quickly.
Okay, great.
Ana Lan did not have any funding from anybody. The kids would come carrying their own, tea bags, and some of them make cakes, and they organize and they bring their skills and their energy. And frankly, they brought me back to life. They made me want to work on FGM again. And I did. And Ana Lan became a household, name in Sudan within a couple of years. If anybody wants to know more about what we do, there is a lot of Facebook and Twitter, and YouTube. We plays and music and all kinds of things. I just want to say also very quickly that these same young people, when everybody gave up on them, started an uprising in Sudan in December 2018 that ended up successful, bringing down a 30-year military dictatorship. And because of that, and we have now a civilian transitional government, in July of 2020, Sudan has passed a law to criminalize all forms of FGM after 60 years of activism. So finally, I just want to say that we have come a long way. As you can see from the numbers, from where we are in understanding of the issue, we have made tremendous achievements, all of us. But we cannot stop now or reduce our efforts just when change is really happening. We're almost there. Financial and political support must be continued. It may even need to be increased for the last push, so that we can reach each and every girl and fill every gap, as the paper today will show, in times of emergency, things like that, gaps happen. But the world is changing fast, and so is Africa. And we had to adapt to that change. We must have the intelligence and the diligence to explore where best to direct our investment to stop this practice everywhere, once and for all. Thank you very much. I hope you've heard me, and I apologize if anybody did not like anything I said, and I welcome any questions or challenges even from anybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Nahid. I really, really appreciate it. And thank you so much for being flexible with us on time. And just a quick programming note from my end. The first thing is that we will be providing a recorded translation and transcription for everyone at the end, and that all of the articles and the references that Nahid has mentioned will be provided to participants along with that recording after the webinar. So I just wanted to make sure that everyone knew that. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that I actually had some questions for Nahid, if you don't mind. And my first question for you, based off of the stuff that you brought up, is that one of the things that you talked about was that FGM can't really be stopped alone in isolation from the social dynamics of a society, right? that, and I found that kind of interesting because part of our webinar today is that during humanitarian crises, the struggle for control of power and resources will be exacerbated, right? How do we ensure that humanitarian actors focus on gender issues like FGM?
Shall I answer?
Yes.
Okay, I think we have to start with the people who are managing these situations, whether they actually the humanitarian supplies, or usually there are clinics providing services. The people running these clinics are the intermediaries that negotiate the power dynamics. So if they are aware, if they are sensitized and be kind of like tuned in how to protect girls and women, they, number one, can speak to the girls and women more, tell them they're there behind them. I believe women and girls have innate energy and power. What we need to do and give them the confidence to stand up and say no. So if the intermediaries, the people bringing the resources or servicing in the clinic, say to them, what is happening in your life? What's happening to your daughter? Just not on FGM. She might be violated. She might be beaten up by her spouse. She might be raped by, some gangs even in immigrant camps. So I think that the ability to sensitize and make sure that the protocols that go down for these so-called relief agencies are very gender sensitive and very women's protection sensitive and women's empower sensitive, I think will go a long way.
Got it. But that is.
At least.
Are there other things?
Well, it's kind of context specific. I mean, for example, recently was engaged with some of the work happening among Syrian refugees in Jordan. And yes, if you can put investment in women's classes, education, giving them some even ways of generating income, trainings, all these are empowerment tools, so they can also stand together. And actually, sometimes the immigrant situation can disempower them, yes, but it could be an opportunity to empower them away from the context of the old country that was actually keeping them down. So it can go both ways, but it depends on what we invest in.
Got it. My second question for you is that it occurs to me that when we talk about FGM, that so many of the women and girls who are most affected are from some of the most vulnerable and marginalized communities across the world. They're facing intersecting factors, right? And then we add to their situation an unprecedented humanitarian crisis, right? And knowing the situation that we currently face, I would love to hear from you what you think it will take to meet this goal of eliminating FGM by 2030.
As I said, the goal is not that far. We need, number one, to get better data as to where is moving forward very well and where it is lagging behind. I've read a lot of research. I still haven't seen a lot of really good, transparent research that is honest, that say, you know what, in this place, they're doing very well.
Honnête et transparent, disant que les choses vont bien.
Alan,
I'm sorry, you're back in our channel again.
Oui, c'est ce que j'ai fait.
Give me a second. Alan, can you just move to the French channel? Because I don't see you as an interpreter. Sorry, everyone. Let's just pause for 1 second because I know there is another interpreter who's been interpreting for a while, and he needs a break. 1 second. Okay, let's just test it.
If it makes you feel better, in the chats, people are sending you courage.
Okay, so can we try again, continue and see if Alan in French will be...
Okay, so just to try to respond, I have to admit, by the way, Mariya, I don't have all the answers.
No, I'm really putting you on the spot over here.
I learn every day. But I think just for my sense, and as I said, I've been away from the international. I'm so deeply, involved in Sudan right now. So I'm a little bit rusty on what's happening in other countries. But I think from just the statistics, there are countries that moved forward very well. And we should just look at the theory of change. You have the pioneers, the early followers, the early adopters, the followers, and then the laggers, and then the resistors. So in some countries, we might have even reached the resistor stage. Okay, so what do you do with those? And you know what? I'm even going to say something maybe even more controversial. I don't know. If you have 10% of resistors, you might just leave them to, not because I don't think these girls are worth protecting, but you can only do so much. And sometimes these resistors will just die away with time. They're older people. They are very conservative in their religious interpretation or whatever. If we have the majority on our side, the rest will take care of itself. That's one scenario. But there are places where they are only now down to 67, 50%, where we need to put more efforts, find out where is the dark places. But as you said, especially in emergency situations, look at how to empower women. To me, that's always the key. I cannot decide what will empower. I mean, of course, giving them employment, giving them education, giving them resources, giving them confidence that they have the right to say, no, these are standard. These are the same anywhere in the world. But how you do it in a particular situation, it will vary. And I would always go in, listen, study, ask questions, look at for my allies. And a lot of them are women, sometimes they're men too. Who are my allies who are going to do it? Unfortunately, sometimes we do want the silver bullet, and silver bullet don't always work.
Yeah,
so yes, true. It's a bit more delicate, deconstruction work.
I do have one audience question for you that I want to ask before we move on, and that question is that have you noticed, knowing Africa specifically as you do you notice a difference on this topic between Western and Eastern Africa? Your microphone is muted. Nahid, Rams, can you help me unmute her microphone? Nahid, your microphone is unfortunately still muted.
My mic was muted. It's very difficult, as I said, to look into all West Africa versus all East Africa. The commonality may be language, or even that, some East Africa speaks English, but if you talk of Somalia, they don't speak English. Some of them speak Arabic, not all of them. So are you talking Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, kind of what is supposed East Africa, or are you talking Somalia, to some extent, Ethiopia? I'm not sure if I can say there is a big difference. I think in general, French-speaking West Africa was a little bit behind in joining the international efforts to stop FGM. And that might be the part that's reflected in the numbers being higher. I don't think something innate in society, because West Africa itself varies so much from one country to another. So yeah, I think it's just the programs there started much later than East Africa.
Got it. Thank you so much. I think that I am going to keep this moving along. So I think that we're going to move on to our panel now. And I want to introduce our panelists. Nahid, thank you so much for answering these questions, for letting me put you on the spot, for bringing up my podcasts during your speech, for your speech in and of itself, for joining us today. It was an honor. Thank you. Okay, so I'm just going to keep this moving. Like I said, we have kind of an ambitious today, these 2 hours. So I'm going to quickly introduce our panelists. First, we have Cynthia Umar. Oh, Cynthia. Cynthia Umar. I do not know what is happening. Umurungi. Cynthia joined the community of practice as a moderator consultant in 2019. She has over 8 years of professional experience in the communications and nonprofit sectors. She has worked with different groups of women and has seen firsthand the issues and violence that women experience. Cynthia is originally from Rwanda and Burundi, but lives in Kenya. She moderated the working group on awareness, prevention, and communication on FGM in emergency and humanitarian settings. Hi, Cynthia.
Hi, you did well with the Umurungi.
I mean, I don't know. I would not give me credit for that. Chiara Cosentino is head of policy and advocacy at the End FGM European Network, where she leads on the advocacy strategy, plans, and activities, and monitors policy developments at national, European, and international level. She has worked in the past with the humanitarian sector and in advocating for the prioritization of FGM in emergencies and has co-organized the virtual dialogue leading to this webinar today. Hi, Chiara.
Hi, Mariya. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for the introduction.
Okay, you guys. So I just want to tell everyone that this panel, I'm going to ask them questions about the findings that they've had from today. And so I'm going to get us started by talking a little bit about the main issue that we're tackling in this webinar. Why have an international stakeholder dialogue on FGM in humanitarian and emergency contexts? What has the process been leading to the drafting of this report and the findings we will be discussing? Chiara, can you tell us a bit about how we got here today?
Sure, thank you so much. Yes, so I mean, the first question that you said is, why do we even bother talking about FGM in emergencies? And as first thing, I can say that 2 out of 3 countries in the top 15 list of countries with the highest FGM prevalence rate in the world are actually humanitarian settings and face fragile situations. So I think that this should already be enough to show the relevance of the topic. But if it wasn't enough, then COVID happened this year. And so I think it was really tragic wake-up call for us all in the sector to really talk on the urgency, showing the urgency of talking about the issue. And to me, this is showing in 2 ways. First, because it really has demonstrated that any country can fall rapidly into an emergency situation, even countries that do not necessarily know how to deal with it, or they do not experience, for instance, conflicts or natural disasters or any other protracted crisis. But the second factor of the wake-up call is also really the COVID situation, and the COVID crisis laid bare the unpreparedness of actors, mainly development actors, of course, who are dealing with FGM and tackling FGM, but who are not used to work in humanitarian and emergency settings. And so it was shown by UNFPA, you know, a study saying that further 2 million women and girls are at risk of FGM on top of the 68 million already estimated by 2030. And this is due to the disruption of activities due to COVID. And so, and to this situation that COVID uncovered, we have to at the fact that humanitarian actors who are used to work in crisis do not work on FGM or do not think it is a priority. So in a world that is more and more prone to protracted crises that will not end tomorrow, I think it really shows very clearly that we need urgently to talk about how to best work on FGM to prevent it and to provide care for survivors in humanitarian contexts. And especially while entering the decade of action to achieving the SDGs by 2030, I think that we really cannot leave no one behind, as that's the motto, and we cannot lose sight of the millions of women and girls who are living in humanitarian settings.
Okay, so you guys saw this reality. There's a gap between humanitarian actors and the actors who are working to eliminate FGM. And you realize that there's likely going to be more crises in the upcoming years, right? So then what did you decide to do?
Yeah, so I mean, we didn't discover anything. I think it was pretty clear. It's just it was just uncovered really, and by the COVID situation, and we did think of putting this on the agenda of donors and governments. So in the run-up to the donors working group on FGM annual meeting that is taking place next week, we decided to gather together all actors, both in development and humanitarian sectors, all worldwide, to really make sure to have a deep conversation about challenges, solutions, concrete recommendations from the field to include and integrate FGM work in humanitarian and crisis situations. And so this ended up being a month online dialogue where 75 participants among grassroots, international and national NGOs, but also UN agencies, academics from 44 institutions or organizations from 28 countries from all the 5 regions of the world took part. And we really discussed in depth this throughout 12 sessions along the month and a half. We convened, and yeah, this was an effort, as was said before, by AIDOS, GAMS Belgium, and us, the End FGM European Network, in the framework of a project building bridges between Africa and Europe to tackle FGM that is funded by the joint program UNFPA UNICEF to ending FGM, and is within the framework of the community of practice. That is a virtual community providing spaces for collective discussion and sharing information. And this is, I really cannot stress it enough, it's been a collective journey. So it's not me talking now, it's not Cynthia talking, it's all the 75 people participating, and we will hear from them later on. And really, I take this opportunity to thank them all, the moderators, because without you, we really couldn't have very strong reports with recommendations and concrete cases from the ground. So thank you so much. And we do hope indeed that donors will take this in serious consideration.
So we all know that in any emergency context, women and girls are disproportionately affected and suffer increased violence and discrimination. Cynthia, you state in the report that this applies also to FGM because emergencies increase risk of FGM and affect services. What does this mean? Could you give us examples from what you have discovered?
Yes, thank you very much. Because if you look at situation where there are crises or humanitarian settings, most of the time there is a whole social disconnect. It means there is lack of social support. So that institution you used to run to, or that auntie that used to help you, or that social support in the community is completely disrupted. That's one. Another thing is that there are different protection systems. If you look at disadvantaged area, most of the time patriarchal area, you'll see that men, if let's say it's a situation of war, they will go and leave the families behind, which means the women and the girls that are remaining behind are really at high risk of whatever that will go their way. But also there is the fact that in crisis, there is loss of livelihood. People do not have access to the basic needs that they used to have in terms of, let's say, peace. So, which means the poorer people get, the more they get vulnerable to different situations. So in this case, you'll see many girls being married off very early. For example, I'll give you an example. In the Horn of Africa, there was drought at some point in 2011, and families would marry off girls as young as 9 years old because they wanted to replace the cattle. You know, when there is drought, everything is dry, the animals die. So whenever you get dowries, those parents used to accept them. So that's just an example. Something else is the disruption of the education system. You know, girls are very protected when they are in class, when they're at school. That is the reason why that there is actually a season for practicing FGM, and it happens most of the time during their holidays or their long holidays when they're home. So when there is a situation that needs the girls to be out of school, out of class, then that means it will increase their chances to be exposed to FGM, unfortunately. And for example, in Kuria, that's a region in Kenya, 2,800 girls were already had undergone FGM by September. That is for the last 8 months during the COVID, the time they were home because of COVID. And there is also the fact that the population moves from one district to another that practices FGM. They will probably get there and they will learn that practice, or sometimes they're actually exposed, or they are pressured to take their girls through that. And that's a situation that, for example, happened in Mali, when you see a whole population of people moving from the north to the south, and they're asked, why is it that your girls are not cut? And most of the time they're poor. Probably they also want their girls to get married. And that's something that they will have to do. Something else that I would like to mention is the shifting of the community priorities. Because when something like a war happens, there is a lot going on. People are hungry. So many are sick. So much is going on that FGM is probably not going to be the top priority. So if you want to talk about it, you'll have to find a way of also inserting the fact that there are people who are sick, inserting the fact that there are other health issues or economical issues, or the fact that people are even scared that the structure they have is probably falling off their head. So FGM is really not going to be considered as the top priority. And lastly, I'd like to mention rape. Unfortunately, in situations like this, when there is lack of authority and structure, you will see that rape is going to be used most of the time as a weapon. And if it happens that girls who have undergone FGM are raped, then they are even exposed to more issues, more consequences, health consequences, or even early pregnancy and other health consequences related to FGM. Yeah.
So I guess a quick follow-up question to that is that over the course of the dialogues that you had and the working groups, were there any recommendations that you were able to find about these things?
Yeah, definitely. Like one of the recommendations that came up is the group said, we would like these kind of solutions to be community-based. Let the interventions come from the community. So even if a community is disrupted, if the community is empowered enough to intervene, to make these decisions, then probably they'll also be able to make decisions in all sorts of settings. That's one. Something else that came up also is the fact that the people that work in this kind of settings, be development actors or even humanitarian actors, these are things they need to be planning together. It is supposed to be a collective effort, working together so that they come up with solutions that work for everyone. Yeah, those are some of the recommendations that came up.
Got it. Thank you. So one quick note that the report that we're referring to here will be available after this webinar. And just quickly, my next question, Chiara, this dramatic situation that Cynthia has described for girls and women affected by FGM in emergencies. You said before that working on it within a humanitarian context, it's not considered a priority. Why is that? What are the obstacles there?
Question, Mariya. So indeed, and there are a couple of factors that I would like to mention here. I think the very first one, and it was also mentioned by Nahid actually in the keynote speech, is that there is a lack of recognition of FGM within the continuum of violence and connection with any other societal factors and any other forms of gender-based violence and discrimination who might be exacerbated during crisis. So I think that's, and Cynthia explained it very well now. So I think that sometimes looking at regarding FGM as a standalone cultural practice that is harmful and that is deeply rooted in culture does not really help looking at the bigger picture of the interconnections and, as you were saying, the intersecting factors that can bring to discrimination. And this is the reason why FGM is sometimes from a humanitarian actors seen and perceived as beyond the scope of an action in humanitarian context, which might need to be more immediate and addressing really the emergency situation. And this brings me to the second factor, which is exactly this: the scope of humanitarian action is immediate, short-term, very time-bound and emergency focused. So this is really, sometimes there is we lose sight of the goal, the bigger picture and the longer-term impact. And the third factor that it's linked to this is, of course, there is, after all these issues, there is a lack of awareness then of what is FGM, because there is no interest actually from the actors to have a knowledge about it. So basically, there is lack of awareness of what it is, and also of connecting, as Cynthia was saying, like FGM with the consequences, physical and mental consequences that this brings within a humanitarian context as well. So the health professionals, for instance, in an emergency context, will not be able to make the connection with concrete complications, for instance, that they see, connecting it to FGM. So these are just three things that come to my mind now in terms of the invisibilization of FGM in the humanitarian context.
Can you actually explain that last point again? I'm not 100% certain that I understood you.
Yeah, so basically, since there is a lack of awareness and of knowledge about FGM, many actors who work in emergency situations might not connect the dots and, connect complications and health situations that might be caused by FGM with the practice of FGM. So they might, for instance, not provide the best care for the person, for the survivor, or they might even re-traumatize the survivor, not knowing what they are facing, for instance, with type 3 or with any other form. So yeah, this was what I was meaning.
Got it, thank you. Many of the things that we've discussed today, the loss of livelihood, the increased poverty rates, forced displacement, this generalized insecurity, all of these things can push families to resort to FGM as a negative coping mechanism. This, of course, also undermines the work that can be done in practice around FGM in humanitarian context. Cynthia, could you tell us a bit more about some of the challenges actors on the ground have mentioned during the virtual international dialogue?
Yeah, sure. Actually, one of them is what you just mentioned, the fact that if there is a crisis that has been on forever or for a long time, for years, it actually undermines the effort that we're already put to fight against FGM, in the sense that budgetary wise, you just cannot plan, because most of the time we have seen that in crisis, they will even move the budget that was for causes like FGM into more urgent needs to fight against the crisis. That's one. And when the crisis has been prolonged for a long time, then it means all the system is actually weakened, the sense of authority or the sense of urgency about FGM is for the long time going to lose the value that it should have. That's the first thing. Something else is that it's something that Chiara actually mentioned. Development workers, most of the time, people who work for the development of the community with different initiatives, they are not necessarily equipped to know how to manage emergency or humanitarian settings. And on the other hand, we have people who work in the humanitarian settings, but they do not really want, or they don't know how to invest in long-term change or mindset change around FGM, because in humanitarian settings, they are worried about things that are happening then and now. Are people going to get food? Are we going to treat this disease real fast before it contaminates everybody? Things like that. But FGM actually cannot be treated like that because it needs time. You need to put in systems to evaluate. So it's not something that you can do fast like that. And something else that I would like to mention, it's responding to FGM as part of the humanitarian cycle. Because when there is something that happens as such a crisis, people get together and they start planning. But at the moment of planning, they're looking at those things that are real quick, real fast, and FGM is not going to be considered. So most of the time they will look at probably gender-based violence. For adolescents, maybe they will look at teen pregnancies, they will look at maternal health, but FGM, because it doesn't give them that sense of urgency or that it is happening then, it's life-threatening at that same second, probably they will not consider it. And one of the recommendations is that actually, while we are planning for the response, FGM has to be counted as just that, you know, to make sure that we do not forget it. Yeah. Yeah, Mariya?
Yeah, sorry, you guys, my computer froze for a second.
Okay.
Thank you for that. But this is not all, right, Chiara?
Fortunately not. But I think that, I mean, Cynthia mentioned very well this lack of prioritization, of course, that we were mentioning in terms of FGM in the healthcare response. I think that this is, we've seen it all also with COVID response and the complete diversion of everything related to healthcare only to COVID. And this is happening on a daily basis in all humanitarian contexts. We just realized it now because it touched us, but I mean in the West. But so I think that what Cynthia was saying exactly is that the healthcare response is really connected only to essential and life-saving interventions. And so this really invisibilizes, again, FGM. If it's not complicating the life of a delivering woman, for instance, in cases of type 3 FGM, that might be very well the case during delivery, but otherwise other forms are not even considered and are maybe not even known by healthcare professionals. And I think that this is really a big issue to provide comprehensive care, including psychosocial and mental health care in the long term. This is really something that it's absolutely not possible and not done, not possible, but it's not done at the moment in a humanitarian and emergency contexts. And I really think that also another big issue here is connected, of course, is a lack of training for professionals and for all humanitarian staff in general, as we were saying before. And this is really critical and crucial because sometimes it can even lead to actually harmful practices perpetrated by even healthcare professionals. Because if you are not aware of what is FGM, what are the issues, what are the root causes, why is it done, that we've heard of cases of re-infibulation actually after delivery by medical professionals in humanitarian contexts. So this is really problematic because, of course, it is a violation of the principle of do no harm. And then another, maybe just another challenge that I am that I would see. Okay, maybe before the challenge, I would like to say that what we recommend in this case is really to have training for all professionals, all relevant professionals, and at all organizational levels. We think it's very important that, and also to have in place protocols, concrete protocols to follow step by step for every professional, because there is a lot of turnover also in humanitarian and emergency context. So to keep the knowledge. And the last point that I wanted to mention is the data collection. I think that came out quite strong in all the dialogue. Of course, data collection is always an issue, even in stable contexts. We always complain about that, but in humanitarian context even more, because of course there is disruption of infrastructures, there is movement of population, displacement, forced displacement. So it is really challenging, and it is even more challenging to track GBV, gender-based violence, because of course it goes underreported already normally, and most importantly in emergencies due to lack of maybe reporting mechanisms and so on. And so really there are a lot of good practices that we came across during the dialogue, but really the main recommendation here would be to empower communities, work with women and girls and communities, train them to collect data, because they are the ones who can actually reach out to the communities, empower them with tools and technologies that can allow that. So maybe mobile phones or offline and online, technology. There are a lot of platforms, and yes, and systematically collect a lot of data and all forms of GBV, including FGM as well. That would be the last challenge that I wanted to mention.
Got it. One of the objectives of the dialogue was also to gather good practices happening on the ground, right? Cynthia, could you briefly mention a few that stood out to you? For all of the rest, we will wait to read the report.
Yeah, some of them, of course, the most practical, you read them in the report. I'd like to mention a story that I heard from a group member from Burkina Faso. She was sharing with us one of her tips or ways her organization uses to communicate to the community. So it's a part of Burkina Faso that really is ravaged by war and is mostly controlled by armed groups. And so in that part, they do not want to hear anything FGM or even child marriage. So what they did is they create a conversation around peace and society harmonization. But at the end of the discussion, they always find a way of inserting FGM and child marriage. And in that case, everyone is happy. They are able to put across their message, and at the same time, they do not necessarily get into strong friction with the controlling group. And another one, it's an example that we got from Senegal and Niger, where people actually work with girls to empower them to use technology, to empower them to use social media, to be able to report abuses and cases of abuse. So on this one, we discussed about the safety of the girls. How safe is it? How accessible are those tools and technology? Obviously, these are discussions that can be taken further, but those are some of the examples that really did stand out. And I would also like maybe to invite a few members of the groups to share some of the ideas. So there is Tamari Esho from AMREF. She has a good practice to share about healthcare workers.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Cynthia, for the invitation. Yeah, so I work for AMREF Health Africa in an End FGM Center of Excellence. So the center is one that provides strategic leadership and coordination to end FGM in a number of African countries within the region. So the mandate of the center is to initiate and catalyze multi-sectoral action, advocacy, collaborations, and build partnerships in terms of strengthening global commitments to end and accelerate FGM abandonment. So I'd like to share with you some of the good practices that we have as AMREF And just to reiterate what Nahid said earlier, that it's very important to have the evidence. So we prioritize research and evidence generation so that we can develop responsive response strategies and be very agile in terms of adaptive programming. So AMREF has, over the past few years, conducted or worked with community health workers. And during this time of COVID-19, this has proven to be a very important engagement, because community health workers were able to actually access the communities directly. So we build the capacity of community health workers using technological platforms. So the community health worker will actually access a platform, a LEAP platform, where they receive some kind of training. And then we were able to integrate FGM, GBV, and ending child marriage messaging, even as they are working around the COVID-19 response. So we see community health workers as crucial community frontline workers who support disease prevention, and of course also support GBV prevention, and also they identify vulnerable girls and women to work with or to engage with, and also refer these women and girls survivors to health facilities or to facilities where they can receive some help. So that has proven to be quite a good strategy. AMREF has also implemented alternative rites of passage programming, and these are community-led. And the alternative rites of passage have been implemented over the last 10 years. And something interesting that has happened is that in 2019, we did an impact study just to see the impact of alternative rites of passage to the communities. And we have evidence that shows that the prevalence of FGM has dropped by 24%, of child early and forced marriage by 6%, teenage pregnancy the same 6%, and also it has increased the number of school years that the girls actually go to school by 2.5 years. So that we see that alternative rites of passage has actually contributed significantly to bringing these changes within this community. So we have integrated FGM into the wider programming in AMREF. So we have integrated in water sanitation and hygiene programs, also in reproductive health, maternal and child health programs, and sexual and reproductive health programs. And this we see provides a very good platform to actually engage with community around the sensitive topic of FGM and of course, child marriage and teenage pregnancies much more easily. So those are some of the things best practices I wanted to share with you today. So really to just call for multi-sectoral approaches in terms of prevention and management of FGM complications, and also really thinking about the comprehensive support we need to give women and girl survivors in terms of medical, psychosocial, and legal aspects. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tamari, for sharing that. Lastly, I think I'd like to introduce Maggie Okan for Global Media Campaign. She also has a few tips or good practices to share about media and radio in refugee camps.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. We, the Global Media Campaign, our focus is working with grassroots activists who are in the community, women, usually survivors, many of them activists to end FGM. So in order to work on this program, we actually put out a survey to 9 countries where we work with activists, asking them all the same questions. What was the best way, in their view and their experience of humanitarian situations, to tackle FGM using the media? Now, there was a number of responses, but what came back from all the countries, all 9 countries, was the use of radio, and secondly, the purchase of radio to be used in IDP and in refugee camps. This is what the activists on the ground are saying. So we have already used radios in Ethiopia. You can buy small radios for $10. What do you do with those radios? We believe that it's the women in the community, and there are activists out there already, like Ifra Ahmed or Sadia Hussein in Kenya, who have, after they've been trained, have used the influencers within a society to go on radio and say, FGM is not a religious requirement, or these are the medical effects of FGM, or to use the voices of the paramount chiefs. Those in the community know who people are listening to. So in the next week, we're going to start in Mogadishu, in Puntland, and also in Jigjiga in the Somali region of Ethiopia, with 80 women from IDP and refugee camps, with the first training that will be run by another activist, Ifra Ahmed and Sadia Hussein, who have worked with media, to train these women on how to use the radio and how to use influencers on the radio, and they're the ones who will decide who their influencers should be in their community, whether it is a religious leader or a paramount chief or a medic. And at the end of that training, which takes 2 days typically, where we show how radio messaging can actually change social norms. And it's happened, for example, in East Kenya, where Sadia Hussein has been doing a campaign for 2 years. At the end of the 2 days, every woman who attends that training will go back with a radio under her arm, which we have now negotiated $10 radios that can be brought back to IDP camps or to refugee camps, in which then she will organize the listening groups within the community, where people in IDP or refugee camps can hear the religious leaders actually saying, you don't need to do this, it's not a religious obligation. Or they can hear doctors talking about how women are dying in childbirth, and they're going to hear them regularly. And the costs of this is really, really quite small. We're looking at, in Mali, for example, where we're doing it, you can have a weekly radio slot for 30 minutes for $170. I mean, it is really quite cheap.
Got it, Maggie. Thank you. Sorry to cut you off.
Yeah.
But thank you for sharing all of that. Is there any last information that you wanted to add to that?
Yeah. Sorry. I didn't want to go on. But what I'm saying is, we can talk about the problems with emergencies and that societies are collapsing and what can we do in humanitarian things. The thing is, these women with very little backing as a community-based women will actually take it and take control themselves and take those radios back. So we have to give them the power. That's what I'm saying. In emergencies, they should take the power.
Got it. Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you for having me. Oh, by the way, sorry, one thing. We're sending around the survey and also a short film of the work last week in Mogadishu to sort of show how it all works. So that hopefully will be part of the information pack that goes around. So it's very specific examples of it working.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to move on to my next question for Chiara and Cynthia. Okay. The report actually finds that there is a serious lack of funding to end FGM and provide care for survivors. Chiara, can we get into the nitty-gritty a little bit? How much are we talking about?
Yes, I'm going to bore you with numbers now. So,
yes, let's get right to the numbers. Now that we've talked that there are some good practices and we've heard about them and we know that the report is coming, let's get to those numbers.
Which indeed are quite frightening, because as a 2020 UNFPA study shows, actually only 11% of the $2.4 billion that would be needed by 2030 to prevent FGM and to eliminate FGM are available right now within the development assistance. So this is really frightening low as a number, 11%.
Wow, yeah, that is a frightening number. That is a low percentage of that 2.4 billion needed.
Yeah, and actually another report, CIFRD, since this year, 2020, from WHO says that the cost of providing care for survivors in 27 countries, in Africa mainly, will amount from between now and 2030 to 140 billion, dollars. Yes, and if we would eliminate FGM by 2030, this would be decreased by 60%, this expense.
Wait, so let me get this right. If we do manage this, we would be able to eliminate this cost by 60%. So you add some money now, and then we'd have much less to worry about later.
Exactly, and the proportion is actually 2 billion investment versus 80 billion savings, basically. So that's the proportion. But unfortunately, these numbers are actually an underestimation because are only focused on about 30 countries who have the national prevalence data on FGM. But we know from a report that was also published this year from Equality Now, the US and FGM Network and us, the NFGM European Network, that there are further 60 countries with not national estimates, but with some evidence in different different researchers that have FGM. So 60 more countries, and we are only talking about 13 here.
Okay.
So it is awfully evident, I think, that the sector is absolutely frightening underfunded, and the development assistance actually is not enough. What is it now on the table is not enough to eliminate FGM by 2030 and to achieve the SDG that we're talking about today, 5.3.
So any way that we're looking at the numbers, we do not have enough money.
Exactly. And actually, we are not, the situation doesn't improve if we look at the humanitarian assistance, because other studies show that in that sector and in that aid, gender-based violence is funded by 0.12% of the overall humanitarian funding. And we saw before in our webinar that FGM among the GBV, funding in humanitarian is absolutely non-existent. So we can basically say that there is virtually no funding in the humanitarian assistance for FGM.
Okay, so to reiterate, only 11% of the funds we need, underestimated funds we need to eliminate female genital mutilation by 2030 are currently available within the development assistance. Today we have Patricia Pennetier, Program Manager at the European Commission Directorate General for International Cooperation and Development within their Gender Equality, Human Rights and Democratic Governance Unit. That 11% figure you just heard, they're a big part of it. Patricia will join and speak for about 5 minutes because we're running really short on time and we want to make sure that we have enough time for audience Q&A. So let's have Patricia join in and speak for about 5 minutes. Thank you, Patricia.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
I appreciate the fact that can you hear me? Do you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Sorry,
well.
We all muted ourselves.
It's okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, so thank you very much for inviting me. I appreciate the fact that I'm coming just after questions on figures and numbers. I'm very happy to, and very honored to be invited today to speak on the occasion of this webinar. The EU has always supported civil society and has established a strong and lasting partnership with CSOs, including, of course, in the framework of the fight against FGM. I was very pleased to hear the previous panelists, and it was very interesting. I'm afraid that my presentation will look a bit boring compared to your testimonies, but be sure that we are as committed and motivated as you are to advance the cause of FGM eradication. So, as you know, the EU considers FGM as an extreme form of gender discrimination. And for this reason, we are deeply engaged in the eradication of this practice and actively participate in international efforts to promote its elimination. So as it was reported by the previous panelist, we all know that the serious health crisis that the world is currently experiencing has set back a number of areas, including violence against women and girls. The achievement of the 2030 agenda is becoming increasingly uncertain, and especially target 5.3 on the elimination of harmful practices. The closure of schools alongside an overwhelmed health system and requirements for social distancing has resulted in the resumption of FGM in practice, and a decrease of access to medical care for FGM survivors. So in the EU, we have worked tirelessly during the crisis to help maintain at least the momentum for keeping the respect of human rights as a priority during the crisis. And we were also very busy to take action to reduce the impact of the virus on the lives of children and young adolescent girls. Recent weeks have seen the adoption of the new EU action plan on human rights and democracy, which explicitly calls to advocate for the elimination, prevention, and protection from SGBV, including, of course, the harmful norms and practices such as FGM. The Gender Action Plan 2021-2025 is about to be launched this month. It's going to be approved, I think, next week, and remains committed to, again, preventing, combating, and prosecuting all forms of SGBV, including FGM. When it comes specifically to humanitarian aid, because I know that it's the topic of the webinar, the EU is also committed to gender in humanitarian aid and the eradication of gender-based violence. And we have also relevant humanitarian EU policies in place, such as the gender policy, the gender age marker, and the protection guidelines. Now, in terms of actions, I would like to present to you the different programs that are in progress. Of course, the flagship program remains the EU-UN Spotlight Initiative to end violence against women and girls, which was launched in 2017. It's a partnership bringing together the EU and the UN, the civil society, the government partners, and the thematic focus on the Spotlight Initiative in Africa is on gender-based violence and harmful practices. So 8 countries have been selected in Africa, where the EU is investing substantive amounts to end gender-based violence, child marriage, and FGM in the countries of prevalence, tackling those issues at multiple levels. I would like to talk specifically on a novelty this year, which is the signature of the Spotlight Regional Program for Africa, which constitutes another opportunity for action to end harmful practices, with a specific stream dedicated to FGM and child marriage. So what is this regional spotlight program? The program's coverage is continental and prioritizes strengthening existing strategies and initiatives. It is composed of 2 streams. The stream 1 supports the overall regional response to addressing violence against women and girls, harmful practices, and promoting sexual and reproductive health and rights. And stream 2 supports the regional response to the prevention of harmful practices, focusing specifically on FGM and child marriage. So it means that the previous EU support to both UNICEF and UNFPA joint programs on FGM and child marriage will be now channeled through this specific stream 2. So stream 1 will be managed by the EU delegation to the African Union based in Addis Ababa, while stream 2 is managed from HQ here in Brussels. So regarding specifically stream 2, which is our topic today, as I said, it will mainly consist of the continuation of the joint programs with more or less the same features, like the policy and the legislative framework, the work with boys and men, the engagement of religious leaders, or the access to medical and social care for girls. But I would like to speak specifically about an important point, which is a component of the program and which is particularly noteworthy to mention at this webinar. The program will focus now on regional, continent-wide women's movement building of regional women's rights organization, Pan-African networks, and CSOs. So it's a bit of a novelty because we are going to focus specifically on this with this organization to collectively advocate and work towards ending harmful practices in Africa. So as I said, the partnership with the African Union Commission, Women's Group, and CSOs will be at the center of the Africa Spotlight program, the regional one. And to this end, the Civil Society Regional Reference Group will be created. It's a bit premature to talk about the achievement of this regional program because it just started. It was signed in March this year. I was going to give you a few examples of the national project in spotlight countries where FGM has been addressed, but if I have only 5 minutes, I think that I will be too long, but I can provide you with example later on. I just wanted to mention that besides the Spotlight program, we are also very much, I mean, the FGM can be addressed also through other financial instruments. We have a European instrument for democracy and human rights. And through this specific tool, we have a few projects, mainly in Africa to combat FGM. For example, in Tanzania or in Guinea-Conakry, where we have a project specifically addressing this issue. And we have also programs which are at a bigger scale because they are financed through the, for example, the European Neighborhood Instrument, like in Egypt, where the EU has approved a 7 million program aiming at accelerating the reduction of FGM prevalence rates in Egypt. So it's a specific program which has been decided with the Egyptian government, and it will be a national program. And I just want to finish by the COVID response, because of course the EU was very much involved in this response. We have swiftly adapted and refocused the EU UN Spotlight initiative to counter the increase of domestic violence and gender-based violence under the COVID crisis. More than 21 million have been front-loaded in record time to prioritize helplines and shelters for survivors, including sexual and reproductive health and rights. So in general, the EU's response to the COVID-19 crisis through the Team Europe package has so far managed to mobilize close to 36 billion euros. And specifically, the EU has disbursed 10 million euros to address the major child protection issues arising from COVID-19 in Africa through a program of the Joining Forces Initiative. It's a collaboration between the 6 leading NGOs working with and for children. And in this program, of course, gender-based violence will be also tackled in some countries in Africa, and especially in the countries which are not covered by the Spotlight initiative. To finish, let me just, I just wanted to talk about, because I asked my colleagues from ECHO who couldn't be here today to give me just a few things about their action. And the EU allocated approximately more than 62 million euros to prevent and respond to gender-based violence from both its protection and health programming, which is a huge contribution. And of course, the EU also continued to be an active member of the call to action on protection from GBV in emergencies, having led the initiative between June 2017 and December 2018. And a new roadmap was also launched in 2020. But if you want to have more details about this initiative, I would recommend you to ask my colleague from ECHO, who will be more specific about that. Okay, I hope that I was not too long. And not too boring.
Oh, thank you so much for joining us today and for speaking. I know that it was short notice from us on your end, and I really appreciate you. And I know that Chiara and Cynthia do as well. Thank you.
Thank
so
you
much,
very much, Patricia. Thank you.
So kind of to echo some of what Patricia said and some of what we said earlier today, donors who provide funding on FGM are mainly development and cooperation actors. Humanitarian donors, unfortunately, aren't likely to see responding to FGM as a priority and do not see it as something to invest in within crises. Advocating for its inclusion in an already underfunded sector of humanitarian aid, the report found, has been challenging. Chiara, do you have more to add to this?
Sorry, my computer froze. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can. And Chiara, I'm sorry. I know that you made this beautiful slide,
so
and I just
it's not gonna.
I'm just gonna say that that we're short on time.
Okay.
So
yeah, sure. That's no problem. No, I was just wanting to conclude by saying that. Well, I'll just share it while I talk, but just to say that really for us here today was an urgent scaling up of funding is what we need, targeted at anti-FGM programming, both in the development and humanitarian funding and sectors, and we really would like to encourage other donors to get involved and to and we call upon donors to, if I cannot go over all of that, but to invest in all these 10 key priorities that we put in our reports, and they are from the dialogue. I don't know how much time do I have, Mariya, so I can just leave it at that if you want. That's no.
I think. Yeah, I think that's fine. I do want to open up the floor for questions from the audience. Actually, I think that that would be best. So I know that we have some questions from before, and I'm going to go try and find them now. And I'm going to ask the audience that if you have questions from that you haven't asked yet, to head over to that Q&A section and put them there, or just continue doing it in the chat and someone will send them to me. But thank you guys for hanging out with us today. And so my first question is that was a question from earlier, and it came much earlier during the keynote from Nahid Toubia, and it was, what are the priorities in terms of research and data collection on FGM in humanitarian crisis situations? And I think that Chiara answered part of the question on data collection earlier, but I wanted to bring it back up in terms of priorities on research. Chiara, Cynthia, do you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, I can say something real quick. I think we really need to fund research. We need to do research to understand exactly what we need to do. Because even if we could have funders on board, we still need to understand the areas and ways to approach this issue. So as long as we are not able to understand the extent of FGM, and how it should be tackled in the society, I think it will be difficult. If I may just bring real quick an example from Yemen. Currently in Yemen, there is no fund to fund FGM, or even women organizations, for example, have diversified and have gone into other humanitarian kind of work or sector because there is lack of fund. And the thing is, there has been a crisis in Yemen for the longest now, crisis which went really from bad to worse in 2015. And at this time, everyone knows that FGM is happening, but we can't really prove because there's no case study, there is no reporting, we do not know how it's done. So that's just one example to show that we need to fund research to be able to tackle FGM from the roots.
Got it. The next question that I have was, what role can religious leaders play in the work against FGM in times of crisis?
So for the groups that we had, at least a number of people in my group said that they really believe that religious leaders are important as important players in this. They didn't say they were the only ones, but they said they're important players in this because most of the society or the decision making is around them. And so they insisted that whenever there is a plan, somebody needs to also bring them on board so that, I guess, that society blessing, but I definitely also concur with what Dr. Nahid said about that. So there were divided opinions, although most of them do think that they are important players in decision-making about FGM. There is a Dr. Nahid who wants to say something. I don't know if you've seen her, Mariya.
Oh, I have not. How do I?
You can unmute yourself, Nahid.
The issue of religious leaders. Please, guys, let us talk sensibly and not talk in broad terms. I am so tired of broad terms. It is not a silver bullet. None of FGM work is a silver bullet. I am not saying don't bring them along, but religious leaders can one day say, yes, it's against Islam, and the next day say it is with Islam. There's a wonderful woman who led Catholic for a Free Choice. I don't know if you know about her, Frances Kissling. She worked on, issues of reproductive rights and abortion in Catholic countries. And she has a great saying. She said, religious leaders love power. They're not going to give it away easily. One day they'll tell you this because UNICEF paid them a program money. And the next day they will say exactly the opposite. Can we get off this bandwagon of religious leaders? Yes, getting one or two of them saying it's not Islam, fine. But you know what? People know that it's not Islam by now. People do know that it has nothing to do with Islam. That doesn't stop them from doing it. Show me one research that says that actually religious leaders saying it's not Islam has made any difference. Number one, as I said, a national religious leader may say something, the local imam in the village might say something completely opposite, and you can't control them. What you need to do is to get women to say enough is enough. We know it's not part of our religion. We are going to stop. I don't know why we're afraid of women. If I'm going to giving the women radios, why are they getting the doctors and religious leaders? Guys, this has been since the 1960s, doctors and religious leaders. Can we get off and try something different? There are a lot of young women and older women even in Africa who can and will say enough is enough. They will talk to other women. They will get their power and voices. But if we keep reinforcing the right of religious leaders to tell us what to do, the right of the village leader to tell us what to do, do you just want to stop FGM but leave women down there as voiceless? That's my question for you.
Thank you so much for that, and for chiming back in, and for staying for the rest of the webinar. I am seeing if there are other questions. I'm going to wait for another moment really quickly to see if there are going to be other questions before we move on. part of it is because I do not speak French. So if the questions are coming in French, I cannot tell. Great. So we do actually have another question. And the question is, how do you work with people who do not believe FGM is an issue? And that's for anyone who wants to take it, Cynthia, Chiara.
I mean, I think that's a question that can be answered in many different ways. It really depends who is this person, because I think that plays a huge role. If the person, of course, is within a community, then I would say bring the change from within. You know, we need to involve people within the community who actually think that that's an issue, and have community dialogues, have empowerment sessions, as we were saying, with you women and girls taking the lead and actually making sure that, you know, there is a small revolution in terms of this is an issue, and to put it on the table. So I think that if the person is that, then I would say this is an issue. Of course, if a person is, for instance, a donor or a government, then I would use different techniques, which still, you know, brings the community at the center, but then using other, you know, maybe advocacy tools or raising awareness through campaigns internationally or online. So I think there are many different answers, I think, to this question, but that's just because we have not that much time, just a few thoughts.
So this last question that I'm about to ask is actually for you, Chiara, and the question is, you mentioned that 2 out of 3 countries with the highest FGM prevalence are in humanitarian crisis settings. Do you think that as a recommendation, all countries where FGM is prevalent should be framed by the humanitarian system as being in crisis? Does the practice of FGM fit the HS definition of a crisis?
I mean, I think that a crisis, I would say that in case, depending on the prevalence, of course, but I would say that, of course, a country which has a high prevalence of FGM is definitely systematically violating women and girls' rights. So I would say there is a systematic gross violation of human rights. In terms of humanitarian, it's a bit different. It's not necessarily connected to human rights. Is more, connected to the instability, the fragility of the institutions, the disruption of institutions and infrastructures, and whether there is, a war or so. It's a different level, but it doesn't mean that that we should frame FGM as a humanitarian. Like that every country having FGM prevalence should be named humanitarian. I don't think that it's not in line with international humanitarian law, but again, I'm not really an international lawyer, so I might say, but I think that this is there is a difference between humanitarian law and human rights law, so that I can say, but I wouldn't say that, if it's not humanitarian, it's not bad. So absolutely, it's absolutely gross human rights violation. Yeah, Nahid, I think, please.
I just want to say very quickly, answering the question is how to convince people. Once we were in a meeting in WHO, and an Ethiopian doctor who works in WHO came in and says, "What is this fuss about FGM? Why are you making such a big deal?" Then there was a video that shows actually what happens to a child. By the end of that video, that man was crying and said, "Never, ever stop working on this." So I think by personalizing it, by showing what happens to children, by testimonials like yours, Mariya. Again, I want to say that women have voices. In Sudan, we are moving the country because women are standing up and saying, "This is what happened to me when I was a child." She goes to talk to her mother and say, "Why did you do this to me? Let us have a conversation." This is what's going to bring about change. And if that conversation goes to the policymakers and these testimonials, they will at least be embarrassed, even if they don't care about women.
Got it. Thank you. Okay, you guys, we are at the hour. And if you don't mind, I'm just going to take about a little longer of your time. I'm going to try and keep it as short as humanly possible because I have I'm going to introduce Valentina Finelli, who is from AIDOS, and she is the project coordinator at the Italian Association for Women in Development. She manages projects to tackle FGM and gender-based violence and ensures sexual and reproductive health and rights for women and girls in Italy, Europe, and internationally. She's going to talk for just a couple of minutes, and I'm going to invite her up here to talk now. Hi, Valentina.
Hi, Mariya. Thank you.
Hi, there you are.
I'm going to try to keep it really short, as I know 2 hours for an online event is quite long, and I'm pleased to say that we still have a lot of participants online. So what we have seen throughout the webinar is that we have an urgent issue to address, and that is how to prevent and respond to female genital mutilation in emergency and humanitarian settings. And as Mariya remembered before, we know that women and girls are disproportionately affected by crisis, and that all forms of gender-based violence tend to rise during emergencies and prolonged crisis. And that is why not only we need to ensure that tackling FGM and GBV is adequately funded, but we also must push to have interventions that are not just gender responsive, but gender transformative. As Dr. Nahid Toubia said so well before, FGM is not a standalone issue, but on the contrary, it is deeply linked to dynamics in society and particularly to gender inequality. So we must ensure that actors working in humanitarian settings are not only trained to provide care for survivors, but also that they are equipped with tools to prevent FGM. And we have to ensure that the response is centered around women and is built upon girls' agency. So the international dialogue that we end today with this webinar, as you heard, has provided a strong set of recommendations and best practices from the field. And all of these are being compiled in a report that we will be circulating by the end of the month. I really hope that this work we have done can contribute to ensure that FGM is recognized as a key issue to address in emergency, and that this can help bridge the gap we have seen between the development and humanitarian work. And also that this contributes to ensure that women's empowerment is prioritized always, and especially in emergency settings. So thank you very much, and over to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the participants of this webinar for having such an engaging and great and lively discussion in the chats, and for everything today. We have one last speaker, and that speaker is Harriet Akulu from Child Protection. She's a child protection specialist from the Prevention of Harmful Practices at UNICEF New York. And Harriet is going to give closing remarks today. Thank you, Harriet, and hello.
Thank you. Thank you so much for such a wonderful webinar today and an active participation. I have learned a lot listening to everybody. It's unfortunate I have to speak at the end, which means I have to say very few words. And also everybody is now tired. So thank you for organizing, and thank you for participating. And I want to bring you so much greetings from Nankali, and also apologies. She could not be here because, as you know, end of year, there's so many competing priorities, but she would have loved to be here. Again, going back to the theme of today, which is really FGM elimination within the current context. As you've all rightly pointed out, this discussion could not have happened at a better time than it is happening right now. You've raised several, important points that I took note of, the recommendations that you have provided to the donors on this particular issue. That's very important. I just want to reiterate that the joint program, UNFPA and UNICEF, are very committed, many of these recommendations require the how to, the action, how are we going to action on some of these things that you have said. And to that end, I want to point out that in the coming weeks, I think, I'm not very sure, within the child protection section in UNICEF, there is going to be a paper coming out on humanitarian development nexus. So how to do it. That's already, I think, in some ways going to be helping practitioners address some of the concerns that you are raising and also passing on to the donors just before their own donor working group meeting. The other key issues, and I really was very inspired by Nahib's presentation. I have not listened to a feminist speak like Nahib has done today in a very long time. So I was very, very inspired by her perspective and the important roles that the women movement has played, in ending FGM. You've spoken a lot about change, change is possible, change can happen, but should happen from within. We don't have to force it. But a key question that came out of your discussion, Nahib, was how can we know what change is happening? Or how can we rather measure change? It's a fundamental question, and within the joint program, I need to mention that as I speak now, in the design phase, we have an ACT framework, what we are calling the ACT. It's a social norms measurement framework that's coming out, and it's going to be a global tool that can be adapted to all the work on harmful practices and also largely GBV, and we can adapt those indicators and see how we can always be able to measure change. Your conversation on value neutrality, I like that very much. And of course, you are aware that the UN has adopted the zero tolerance to FGM, and every February 6th, we are always commemorating this important day. So as we move forward, of course, to the last decade of action, we must now focus on those things that still hold us back. What is it that is holding us back that we have not been able to do to eliminate FGM? Again, I think listening to Nahib, because she's inspired me a lot, we need to revisit our past. Where did we start from? This work on FGM elimination as we move in these last 10 years. Again, we need to prepare to program within humanitarian development nexus. I think we are not going, COVID just happened, but as you raised it, increasingly, and you have also pointed out in your own presentation and finding, is that there are so many countries in Africa and elsewhere where we have existing humanitarian concerns and where FGM is happening. So we need to have that mind shift, and we need to have the money for this. I'm very pleased to hear the announcement from EU. And definitely EU is a big supporter in this area, and also to the joint program. They are contributing, to Stream 2, as they have mentioned, on FGM and child marriage in Africa. A good thank you. And again, somebody mentioned about the issue of research. It kept on coming constantly. They need to do more research. I could tell you from several analyses that has happened, including those done by Population Council, we have had quite a number of research. The one big problem that we've been having is that the research happening in the area of FGM is not influencing programming within FGM. There's a disconnect. And as we speak right now, the joint program, UNFPA and UNICEF, are engaging together with WHO and Population Council, and they will soon be speaking to experts like you on the need for a global strategy on a research gap. What are those other research questions that we have not been able to define up to this point, so that we can facilitate, fast track the elimination of FGM in the next 10 years. So this is in the offing, and you will hear about it, a global strategy on a research, a global research strategy, looking at what other gaps exist and priorities that we need to focus on. So without much ado, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you. I want to thank you again for inviting us and for also organizing this, and also for the facilitation and the participation. Thank you. Over.
Thank you. Right, I think that the last thing that I want to say before you all go off and continue on with your days or evenings or afternoons is that a recording of this will be made available, that a lot of the resources that you had asked for in the chat or anything that was mentioned during the webinar today will be made available. A transcript of today will be made available. And lastly, the report that we have discussed today will be made available. And so thank you all for attending. Thank you for being here with us today. Thank you to everyone, and have a good remainder of your evening. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.